November 24th, 1326. The square of Hereford, a misty town in England, overflows with a mix of fear and curiosity. Nobles in elegant cloaks, clergymen tightly gripping their rosaries, merchants and peasants, all have gathered for a single, dark purpose: to witness a brutal show of public justice. A wooden platform, rising above the crowd, stands like a stage of death and shame. In the center, guards drag a man in his early 40s. His face is vacant and pale. He has been preparing for his end with days of starvation, an attempt to delay the inevitable. His once magnificent clothes now hang on him like a dirty, tattered shroud. Just a few years prior, this man was the most powerful person in England, second only to the king. But today, amidst the cheers of the crowd, he is about to be executed in a way that pushes the limits of human imagination. His name is Hugh Despenser the Younger, royal favorite and, according to whispers, the secret lover of King Edward II. Within hours, his body will be dismembered, his blood and screams filling the square, a warning to all who covet power and fail to heed the consequences. But to understand the story behind this brutal end, one must pull back the curtain of time. Hugh's rise and fall is a tale woven with greed, betrayal, dark conspiracies, and scandals that shook a kingdom. Hugh Despenser the Younger was born around 1286 into one of England's most powerful noble families. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, was a loyal servant to Edward I, and his mother, Isabel de Beauchamp, came from the powerful bloodline of the Earl of Warwick. Hugh had all the privileges a medieval aristocrat could dream of: status, education, access to the court. But from a moment of his birth, his destiny was to serve the crown and preserve his family's influence. Everything took a dark turn in 1307 when Edward II ascended to the throne. The king's lustful and openly male-oriented passions were more than just a secret whispered among the nobles. It was a danger that echoed within the stone walls of the court. The first favorite, Piers Gaveston, had already entered this dark play. His arrogance and defiant demeanor unsettled the nobles as he openly displayed his power. The storm broke in 1312 when the nobles, by their own hands, delivered justice. Gaveston was brutally captured and executed, his blood and fury staining the stones of the square. The void left beside the king was an open door for Hugh Despenser. He began to subtly circle the king like a shadow. By 1316, he had been elevated to the position of royal chamberlain, giving him constant oversight and access to the king's inner chambers. Their bond deepened with a dark loyalty and a dangerous passion. To solidify his position, Hugh married Eleanor de Clare, an alliance that brought him the powerful lordship of Glamorgan in the remote and misty hills of Wales. But Hugh's greed and thirst for blood and power were insatiable. He wanted more. With his boundless ambition, he knew that by leaning on the king's dark favor, he could seize everything he could get his hands on. The stones of the court watched his rise in silence, heralding a rise woven with whispers, conspiracies, and shadows. Using the dim shadows of the royal court for his own dark ambition, Hugh began to seize lands across England and Wales. He bent the cold letters of the law, usurping properties from his rivals, from widows, and even from his own relatives. He had no grace, no justice, and he gained enemies one after another, each silently seething. By 1321, the storm clouds had fully gathered. The barons, no longer able to tolerate Hugh's corrupt soul and insatiable greed, rose in revolt. Hugh was exiled, but he refused to vanish in his silence and shadows. He turned to the dark seas, becoming a pirate, plundering English merchant ships in the ominous stillness of foreign waters. Yet, Hugh could not stay away for long. His shadow would always return. In 1322, Edward II rose from the ashes of the rebellion and reclaimed his throne. With the king's renewed power, Hugh returned, more ruthless and formidable than before. From 1322 to 1326, the Despensers, father and son, were no longer in the shadow of the throne, but were almost one with the crown itself. The younger Hugh became the gatekeeper to Edward, shaping the kingdom's policies with his own hands and transforming the court, along with its cold stone walls, into his personal kingdom. The chronicler Jean Froissart wrote, "Hugh is king in everything but name, and he was not wrong. But the whispers of the court, the rumors that circulated in secret shadows, made the situation even darker. Whispers echoed within the stone walls that the bond between Hugh and Edward was not limited to politics alone. Hugh had a wife and children, yes, but those at court suspected, like a dark secret, that he was also the king's hidden lover. In medieval England, such an accusation was not just a scandal. It was the harbinger of a curse full of whispers of death. In the darkness of that era, homosexual relationships were called sodomy, and they were branded by the merciless eye of the church as a sacred crime committed against both nature and the divine order. The truth of the accusations was irrelevant. The rumor itself was enough to poison Hugh's reputation and bring down his rising reign. Queen Isabella, Edward II's wife, harbored a deep hatred for Hugh's presence. Isabella, of French royal blood, was once the powerful voice of the court, but Hugh's rise had completely eclipsed her. Over the years, her influence, her wealth, and even the love of her children had silently slipped from her grasp. In 1324, Hugh took a step too far. He usurped lands from Isabella, threw her servants into dungeons, and most heinously, tore her children from their mother's arms and handed them over to his own wife, Eleanor. For Isabella, tolerance had ended. In 1325, she was sent to France for peace negotiations on behalf of England. But her plans already exceeded a diplomat's duty. She was sowing the seeds of a conspiracy in the shadows. In Paris, she crossed paths with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron who had escaped from the Tower of London and was exiled, harboring a deep hatred for Hugh. The two united, victims of a mysterious love and a deadly alliance. They wove a dark plan to erase Edward and the Despensers from the stage of history. And in September of 1326, Isabella and Mortimer returned to England with silent steps. They did not have a magnificent army with them, only the cold, deadly shadow of mercenaries, a harbinger of a fate woven with whispers and blood. Nothing more was needed. The English nobles, fractured by years of Hugh's greed and Edward's blind favoritism, instantly rose in rebellion. The king's power evaporated. Edward, Hugh, and the elder Despenser fled west with the royal treasury. But it was too late. Edward II and Hugh Despenser, embarking on a desperate flight in the misty valleys of Wales, were doomed from the start. Their allies abandoned them one by one. The nobles turned, the people turned. They were now fugitives, clinging to what little power and wealth they had left to survive. The Despensers, father and son, went their separate ways, with no choice but to be captured. Hugh the Elder, a hardened warrior, made it to Bristol, but here he fell into the cold grip of fate. Local forces captured him. What followed was a dark fairy tale, savage and swift. He was hanged while still in his armor. Then, without any mercy, his head was cut off, his body was quartered, and the pieces were thrown to the dogs. The end of a man who once loyally served the kings of England remained a bloody story. Edward and Hugh the Younger went deeper into the dark forests of Wales, but the walls were closing in on them. Lacking support and pursued by the enemy army, the two were finally captured near Neath. Edward, once the ruler of a mighty kingdom, was taken into custody. Within a few weeks, he would be forced to abdicate his crown to his 14-year-old son, the future Edward III. But Hugh's fate would be far more terrifying. Sensing the shadow of the apocalypse, Hugh tried his only option, a slow suicide. He stopped eating, preparing his own death in the hope that his body would waste away before his enemies could reach him. But this was not enough. In mid-November, still breathing but gaunt and skeletal, he was dragged along the border and brought to Coldstone, Hereford. There, on the gloomy morning of November 24th, Hugh stood before his most ruthless enemies, Roger Mortimer, Queen Isabella, and a dark court of barons groaning under her cruel rule. But this trial was merely a stage, a theatrical curtain. His fate had already been sealed long before his capture. The accusations were long and deadly, shadows of treason, stains of theft, usurpation, bending the king's will, corrupt power games. The court took care to cloak all this darkness in a legal guise. It was, in fact, an act of revenge wearing a mask of justice. But everyone knew the truth. Hugh Despenser the Younger was convicted of all charges, and his punishment would be the most horrifying thing England had ever seen. That morning, the market square was filled with a shadowy crowd. People had come to watch this ruthless spectacle. This was not just an execution. It was a ceremony, a message, and a nightmare unfolding before the eyes of the public. Isabella was there, Mortimer was there. Nobles, soldiers, townsfolk, and people from distant villages. They were all here to see how power could be humbled. Hugh Despenser, bound to the high ladder, was preparing to live out his fall for all to see. On his head, a crown woven from thorny nettles was placed, a mocking reminder of the power he once held beside the king. The pain, combined with the victim's gaze, cast a dark silence over the square. Verses from the Bible were inscribed in shaky letters on Hugh's bare skin, his pride and wickedness cursed. Then, the torture began like the cold breath of darkness. From the pen of historian Jean Froissart, the executioners cut off Hugh's most private parts and threw them into the fire before his eyes. This was a deliberate symbol, a curse upon the perverted desires he was accused of having with King Edward. The crowd shouted with a mix of horror and mockery. Some laughed slyly, while others roared with rage. But the torment did not end there. With a deep knife cut, Hugh's abdomen was ripped open while he was still alive. His internal organs were slowly and ritualistically removed and writhed in the flames. The square was filled with an agony resembling the most terrifying scream a human ear could ever hear. In the words of witnesses, the scream of a man being dismembered with full consciousness. After this long ordeal, Hugh was finally hanged from the gallows, but his humiliation was not yet complete. His severed head and the 4 pieces of his body were displayed across the kingdom, serving as a warning to those who had overstepped their bounds. His head was mounted on a pike at the gates of London, like an ominous warning, a dark whisper for every passerby. But why such cruelty? Why such theatrical violence? This was not just punishment. It was a symbolism, a language of darkness. Hugh's execution was arranged as a terrifying atonement for the sins believed to have corrupted the kingdom in the eyes of the public. His public castration was not just physical agony, but a loud declaration of shame and horror. Because this man had broken sacred bonds, defiled royal authority, and cursedly violated the order of nature. At the same time, this was a sweet, bloody, and dark revenge for the countless nobles, widows, and common people whom Hugh had deceived and oppressed throughout his reign, a kind of brutal justice, a punishment that operated in the shadows. For years later, in 1330, Hugh's widow, Eleanor de Clare, was granted permission to collect and bury the remaining parts of his body. But almost nothing was left. A head, a thigh bone, a few scattered bones. A depressing grave for a man who once ruled England from the shadow of the throne. Edward II's fate was no brighter. Initially, he was held in captivity, surrounded by shadows and empty walls. But in September 1327, shortly after Hugh's terrible end, Edward died mysteriously at Berkeley Castle. The most chilling and dark legend says he was executed by having a red-hot iron rod inserted into his rectum. This horrific method left no visible wound, but was a cursed reference to his dark relationship with Hugh. While the truth of this story is debated, its symbolic weight is terrifying and clear. Just like Hugh, Edward's death was woven with a poetic cruelty, a shadow play designed to humiliate, erase, and cleanse the kingdom of its rotten morals in the eyes of the public. The fall of Hugh Despenser the Younger was not just a political collapse. It was a national purification, a dark reckoning. In the eyes of his enemies, his body had to be broken, burned, and scattered across the kingdom, not just to destroy the man, but to erase the ambition, power, closeness to the king, and rumored sexuality he represented. From medieval England, this was not just a scandal, but a dark crisis, a nightmare full of shadows. But the darkest part of the story is that those who brought Hugh down, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, would also be dragged into the shadow of the same curse. Only 4 years later, in 1330, the young King Edward III, having just seen his 17th spring, took the reins of the throne into his own hands. Mortimer, the man who effectively ruled England through the Queen, was put in chains. Unlike Hugh, he was spared slow torture but could not escape the gallows. He was hanged as a traitor, his neck a warning pointed to the sky. As for Isabella, the queen once consumed by the fire of revenge, she was stripped of her power and condemned to silence, to the shadows of house arrest. Her magnificent revenge faded like a dark whisper. In medieval England, power always came with a deadly clock. Power itself was a curse that raced against time. And yet, 7 centuries later, the story of Hugh Despenser still echoes like a spine-chilling tale in the shadows. In a recent poll, he was voted the most terrifying English villain of the 14th century, even ahead of kings and generals. His name continues to live on in plays, novels, and dark scenes. A deceitful, ambitious, arrogant, and ultimately cursed figure, the darkest allegory of the Middle Ages. But modern historians paint a more complex picture. Yes, he was ruthless. He was greedy. He mercilessly used his influence over Edward II to consolidate his own power, multiply his wealth, and destroy his enemies. This is the most shadowed face of power and ambition, a Gothic tragedy where power and death dance. Even amidst the grim and harsh shadows of medieval politics, Hugh shone like a dark star, a man with almost no conscience and even fewer loyal friends. His banishment of enemies, his usurpation of lands, and his imprisonment of the queen's servants had earned him enemies in every layer of society. However, not all of the accusations against him were forged with truth. In the 14th century, accusing someone of homosexuality was a political dagger, a weapon in a power game. How much did the truth matter? The real issue was shame and control. Many historians suggest that the homosexual accusations leveled against Hugh and Edward II were exaggerated or entirely fabricated. The purpose was to humiliate them in the public eye and bring them down from power. In the Middle Ages, homophobia was not just a cultural phenomenon, but a strategy. By branding a rival with sexual perversion, you could erase their legacy, rot their alliances, and direct the public's anger towards them. For Hugh and Edward, this anger became their inevitable end. Their story reveals the dark and theatrical nature of medieval justice. Hugh's execution was not just a punishment. It was a spectacle, a ritual. Every stage of his death, castration, burning, hanging, beheading, was woven with symbolism and fear, designed to cleanse sin and restore moral order. Killing was not enough. The body had to become a message. And the message was clear. This is what happens to those who overstep the boundaries of power. This is what those who mix personal desires with political authority will face. But perhaps the darkest lesson to be learned from the story of Hugh Despenser is this. These games of power and conspiracy are not just shadows from a forgotten age, but a dark mirror that still surrounds our present. Even after centuries, the bloody, insidious intricacies of power and favoritism still grip us. The rise and fall of elites still play out before our eyes like dark shadows. We still watch as powerful people are torn apart by the weight of their own ambitions and greed. And we are still in a society where sexuality, especially when it is weaponized in the blind darkness of politics, can be used to trample and destroy a reputation. Hugh's story is unsettling not just for its brutality, but for its familiar horror. He rose swiftly, flew too close to the sun, and when he fell, the descent was not a defeat, but a show, a lesson carved on his skin and bone, a scene of fear played out before thousands of eyes that echoes for centuries. From a privileged, noble child to a shadowy ruler of England, from a royal chamberlain to a castrated traitor, from a name admired to one remembered with a shudder. Hugh Despenser's rise and fall is one of the bloodiest and darkest stories in English history. His name may be long forgotten and his bones scattered, But what he became and what the world turned him into still reveals, with a chilling whisper, the dark edges of politics, sexuality, and revenge. And even today, this dark story whispers, power is never free, and history never forgets.